conversations that I have with folks. So as I said, I've been doing this for about 5 years. The first bit that I had come out was in a journal called the Canadian Geographer. And I looked mostly there at the CIDA side of things because my background is in looking at development institutions, particularly the U.S. Agency for International Development and some of the larger NGOs and things like that. So I was interested in what was going on at CIDA, and that took me into the sort of larger realm of this creation of a new institutional culture. So that article was looking at the development side of things, partly because I expected a larger impact on CIDA than on DFAIT, because the DFAIT was larger. My interest was on what was happening in development policy. There I kind of looked at 3 different processes that were ongoing. One was the structural change as they were bringing the 2 institutions together, particularly the merger and how it was going to affect people in their day-to-day work. Because I'm interested in sort of bureaucratic labor and how people think of themselves as they work for state institutions. It's from that, the second process was sort of institutional.
Jamey, I apologize. I'm just going to put everyone on mute. Somehow I unmuted everyone, I guess, and I'm just going to put everybody on mute.
Okay.
And then unmute you if that's okay. So
yeah, that's fine.
Hold on one second.
Sure.
Sorry. Oh, now it doesn't. I can't figure out how to do that. Sorry, one second.
Let's see. I can see. Yeah, there's a few people that don't have the little mute icon on. There we go.
Yeah, yeah. It should. Okay, I think everyone should be muted, and you should not. They should not be able to unmute themselves. Okay. So there we go. Sorry about that.
With great power comes great responsibility, Pam. So be careful.
Yes, we're still learning all this stuff. Thanks.
Yeah. So from that came the sort of institutional culture clashes that were developing as people learned how to work together, and that was in part tied to the third process, which was the actual physical workspace move for a lot of people. So that first article was sort of laying out a lot of the different things. I talked to a couple people from PAFSO for that. And the unions were all very helpful in connecting me to people, because I've been active in my own faculty union. And so I knew that if you talk to people who are working in the union context, they'll be a little bit more aware usually of the kinds of issues that are arising for people in their day-to-day work, because that's where they take them. The second piece that had come out was a little more directly on the Foreign Service and on PAFSO. That was in a journal called Political Geography that came out last year, about a year ago. So there I look more directly at what Foreign Service officers do, the role of the structural changes over time, a sort of more historical look at how self-identity among the Foreign Service Corps, ideas about professionalism, sort of elite status, protecting the entry requirements into the Foreign Service, how all that sort of shaped over time in relation to these larger sort of structural changes, like the folding in of the Trade Commissioner Service in the 80s, going back even to some of the changes that Pierre Trudeau instituted in the 70s. And there was 2 processes that I was looking at. One was the sort of unique culture of the Foreign Service that's national, because everybody's got their sort of national service, but also international, because there's a kind of international set of norms around diplomacy and diplomatic practice. And how does national interest emerge from that? How do people see themselves as fulfilling sort of this national role while participating in this international system of diplomacy? And then 2, like how that is then tied to collective bargaining, what PAFSO does. And there I went back and looked at a bunch of old PAFSO newsletters and built on the interviews that I've done. And I've done now probably about 85 interviews over the last few years. Not all with Foreign Service officers, but sort of spread across the EC, PM, MCO, and FS categories. And I know the MCOs are now part of the FS, so that was part of what has come out as well. So, this is where it sort of got me into thinking about, what does it mean to be professional, to be adaptable, to have judgment, and also to do all this in a sort of unionized context. And there's where I started to get a lot of comments. This is where the last piece comes out that I was going to talk about today that just came out. So over and over, people would mention the clothing that people were wearing. It just sort of would come up unprompted in my interviews because, I was asking questions about, what, I had a series of like 5 or 6 open-ended questions for people in these interviews. And I did a lot of them in Ottawa. I did quite a few over Skype with people around the world. I've done 2 embassy visits. Um, so I can sort of see people out at post because I know it's always different at post. Um, and over, it just came up like people would talk about the clothing that other people were wearing. Um, so there was this sort of stereotypical view that the development people were the Birkenstocks crowd, and on the other side, the foreign service people were the sort of suit and tie world. And it came up so many times, unprompted usually. It came up about a dozen times before I started saying, somebody told me there was this joke about, hippie clothes coming over from Portage, and, people wearing Birkenstocks to the office, and, they would kind of laugh about it usually, not always. Some people were quite serious about it. But yeah, it became clear that this was kind of one of the proxy measures by which you could tell previous institutional affiliation. Um, and that's a window into the struggle to find a sort of cohesive institutional culture in the department, even several years after this merger has happened and everyone's been moved and things are supposed to be a little more coherent. I think the coherence is the term that's used in the department now. I've talked to a couple people in the last year that have said this is the term that has been settled on, that coherence is what we want. Clearly that hasn't quite fully happened. I don't know that it ever does in any big institution where you've got multiple mandates. But clothing is sort of jumped out at me as a kind of proxy for recognizing certain kinds of difference between the work that people did, the previous institutional affiliation. It's linked to ideas about who's professional and in what ways. And then I think that kind of sometimes reflects the importance that the sense of importance that people have of their work in the department, whether it's taken seriously, whether they themselves are going to be able to maintain some kind of professional or career standing. As there's quite a bit of institutional churn, as all of you know. So clothing, it's not something that I know much about. I mean, you can't see me from here down, but I'm not the sharpest dresser, I've been told, on student evaluations of my teaching. Change your shirt was something I've heard before. So clothing, it was interesting because there's a whole lot of research in geography and some other disciplines, including now in diplomatic studies, on embodiment, on the idea that there's a professional category, or that gender is the sort of fixed notion. The clothing you wear sort of is a marker, and it's changeable, it's mutable. It stands in for all kinds of things. It's a clear outward expression of our identity, but it's also sort of constrained in all these ways, by the workspace that we're in, by gender categories, by class status, whether you can afford all the fancy clothes you need to go to work. So there's all kinds of things that come out. So it took, my co-author was my research assistant who just finished his master's degree and is now going to be at Carleton actually for a PhD starting next year. But yeah, he and I went through a whole lot of literature, academic literature on clothing, some of which is quite mundane, right? Like clothes express identity. It's like, okay, so what? But I saw it over and over in my conversations with people, and so that's why I sort of pulled it out. And I wasn't sure what to make of the gender aspect, because I know there's been a big push in the department over the last several years, last several decades even, in the Foreign Service, to sort of diversify the Foreign Service. And this has come up in many of my conversations, the last round of interviews that I did, where I started talking particularly to some of the newer hires, people who are early career. The concern about dealing with student debt versus having the money to spend on clothes, career opportunities beyond the entry level, which comes up also for mid-career folks. It just seems there's a lot of concern in the department about the direction of the department, about making sure that everyone is sort of on the same page mandate-wise. And when there's not clear direction from sort of leadership, which I get the sense that sometimes there is and sometimes there's not. I can't say for sure, because I didn't get to talk to a lot of people at the EX level, only a couple. my focus is really on that sort of day-to-day working level. And there, people don't always know what's going on. They don't always have the information they want or think they need. And so clothing just becomes an easy way to express a lot of these tensions, right? But it also becomes a way for people to kind of, one thing I also found was there's quite a few people who started working more closely with their development colleagues. And there seemed to be a general sense that, yes, things were perhaps a little more casual on that side. Not always, but sometimes. And it's created a different kind of work environment in the sense that there's several men who told me, I don't have to wear my jacket all the time. I can take my tie off. And it was quite interesting because I sort of thought, well, if you look at the history of diplomacy, and some of it's in the article, I had to cut some of it, but for word count reasons. But there's a sense that the diplomacy is a man's world, right? Historically, and I've some of the historical research in the second article I talked about also, people in the past in the 60s, 70s, looking back on the sort of golden era of Canadian diplomacy, they would often talk about the Foreign Service as being a club of gentlemen that are all peers, of people who are willing to roll up their shirt sleeves and do the hard political work. They're not joining a big travel agency, although that's the way it seemed that it was turning in the 70s, according to a couple people. That all the signifiers of the diplomatic standing are tied to men's suits, right? Pinstripe suits, particularly, is the the moniker that people would use, right? The sort of pinstripe suits at a champagne party in some foreign capital, or you're in the headquarters with your shirt sleeves rolled up, right? No one ever talks about, the diplomacy that's happening while you're struggling with control top pantyhose or something. So there is a bit of work now on gender and diplomacy where people are sort of uncovering the history of Foreign Service spouses, particularly wives, who used to be included in everyone's performance review if you were abroad, I believe, up into the 60s. And their clothing was very important too because they had to go to these social functions. But as things have diversified, clothing becomes this proxy. But it still seems there's the idea as the merger was happening that a way to express this tension over the relative importance of diplomacy and trade and development, and then now consular work as well in the department as this institutional mix is getting worked out. Clothing just becomes an easy way to do that, right? Because you can tell who used to be in which section by the clothing they wear, by how they hold themselves. There's concern, I know, over erosion of standards for entry into the Foreign Service, which I found was a long-standing thing that goes back 40 years at least. The constant rounds of PAFSO negotiating about who's allowed to enter the Foreign Service, the relative number of political appointees, things like that. So there's always this concern, and now it's expressed through, like development people are coming in, or we don't have enough promotion exercises. So yeah, I think in all this, clothing is just such an outward, easy marker that people have latched onto it. To the point where I think a lot of people realize in my interviews it was stereotypes that they're talking about that aren't always true, but it's still a good sort of heuristic model for people to just kind of talk about, right? As an entryway for saying like, well, but the development side is like this, or the trade side is like that. And yeah, I don't really know where to take this research now. I told Pam the other day in a conversation we had, I have a couple of things on the go, but as far as the clothing stuff, it just came out of all these conversations where it came up so many times that I felt I had to do something with it and sort of read out from it into like, what is this telling me about what's going on in the department with institutional culture? But yeah, I'm happy to also talk. The other two things I have on the go right now, I've got one thing I'm writing about sort of risk assessment for people posted abroad, because I'm very interested in the division in the department where you're either in headquarters or you're abroad. There's not many arms of any government where you've got lots and lots of people representing the state out in the world through sort of a structured system like you have with the Foreign Service, which is sort of one of the reasons that makes the Foreign Service unique within the public service. So the idea of how risk is assessed, and then I'm trying to talk about embassy design, like the actual workspace, but also the Havana syndrome cases that came up, and what that means for how departments assess who should be posted abroad, how the space should be configured, sort of taking in a couple different directions there. And then I'm also interested in the kind of social networks that people build at post. The idea that there is a sort of circulating rotational community that can be quite disorienting for people. But one person told me it was a golden cage. In The Ugly American, they describe it as a golden ghetto. So this idea that there's something to this sort of rotational lifestyle, but it's also quite difficult. So another piece on how people build community within that. Which ties back also into issues of gender, family, travel with you if you go abroad. I will say one person told me, we can talk about this. I don't want, because this is a closed meeting, I guess, so to speak. I didn't mean to be punny, but air the dirty laundry that I've heard, with no names, of course. Somebody told me that when they joined the Foreign Service, another person told them, "Oh, welcome to the Department of Alcoholics and Divorcees." And I thought, oh, that's a weird thing to tell me right off the bat. But it has come up a few times, and it's one of those things that shows up in the wider academic literature that's emerged. Although, as I was going to say, I told Pam the other day, a lot of what I've written about is not anything that anyone in the department would really be asking as a practical matter, right? Like, I don't think anyone is having a conversation as a practical matter of like what to do in the department. Like, well, should we have a dress code? What do we tell people to wear? I don't think that would be possible, but it is something that is academically interesting, just because of the window it gives us into what's going on. And these comments about divorce or building community, or what the workspace is like. I mean, those are all things that are sort of low grade issues that affect people's day-to-day work, but maybe they don't pop up on a higher up's radar screen as something that needs to be managed. But it is something that affects how people think about themselves as they, pursue a career that most people don't leave, right? I mean, there's not a lot of attrition in the Foreign Service, right? So I mean, it's a little bit like academia, right? Like, no matter how awful it is in your day-to-day work, as people sort of experience minor inconveniences or major disasters or catastrophes, you're not going to leave, right? 'Cause there's a lifestyle that you've grown accustomed to or sought out. And so I think there's an interesting sort of connection there between how people think of themselves and the kind of work they're doing, and then that's where all of this comes out. So that was a bit all over the place, but yeah, I guess, how long have we been talking? About 15 minutes? Is that?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay. I don't know if other people have had a chance to read it. I mean, I gave that link to Pam, and I know you shared it. And the journal gave me 50 electronic off-prints, which means they allow someone to download it 50 times before they put it behind the paywall. And I imagine that went fairly quickly. But if anybody wants a copy of this, I gave Pam a copy, and I have copies, and you can email me, and I can make sure that you get it. But it's academic writing. It's not like it's scintillating, exciting writing. I'm very self-deprecating, so I'll just leave it at that.
No, it was very fun to read. I mean, I don't know if anybody else, I don't know if this is something that went out of fashion, after I was in university, when we won't talk about what years those were, but I remember from first year sociology and anthropology reading a case study of the Nasarima. And it was like, you read about the Nasarima, and they ate a diet that was high in meat. They always had a starch and a vegetable with their meals. They lived in dwellings where they had these altars in their houses with with fountains and so on. And the more you had of these altars, these rooms with the altars, the more the higher status the person was. And they brushed their teeth with a stick with boar's bristles on the end. And of course, when you got to the end, the punchline was that Nasarima was American backwards, and that it was describing what sounded like a very odd version of North American culture in this anthropological language. And I felt a little bit like that when I was reading your article. Like, yeah, these are all things that we notice about ourselves and that we observe, but that we probably wouldn't comment. Somebody says they remember that study, so that makes me feel better. It's like, and yeah, it was a little bit of that feeling, which was kind of fun. But maybe just I will ask everybody who has questions, if you want to talk, you can use the little raise your hand icon and I'll come and unmute you and call on you. But I had one question myself just before, was just what surprised you about your research? Was there anything that was unexpected that you wouldn't, aside from the fact that the subject came up, but was there anything about the whole DFAIT-CIDA thing that surprised you? And someone else also asked about IRCC. We have the immigration stream, and they're asking if you interviewed any of them and if you had any thoughts on how they fit into all this.
No, I didn't. Well, I'll answer that one first. I didn't interview anyone particularly from immigration. I interviewed a couple of people who had been in immigration before, and they talked a bit about that work. But it's in part because of the way I came into the research, looking at the development officers. And I had no idea really, I mean, I had a little bit of inkling because I wouldn't have walked in totally blind, but I didn't really understand how complicated the structure of the Treasury Board designations are. And the really difficult nature of moving between different kinds of positions and categories and things like that. So yeah, that was a bit difficult. I mean, I didn't get access to everyone. The Shirk grant that I had was not huge, and being able to go and do that kind of work with immigration officers. I mean, it's in part because I was interested at first in what does this mean for policy, as far as how diplomacy, where there's a bit of autonomy, and there's a researcher out on the West Coast, I think it's Simon Fraser, named Jamey Essex, who has talked a lot about sort of practice-based accounts of diplomacy, that you know what you're doing because you're doing it, right? And virtuosity, right, where there's a kind of a sense that a lot of foreign service officers, diplomats, are given a long leash, right? There's a virtuosity to it, right? Like, you're a virtuoso, you know what you're doing, so you're allowed to do it. I didn't get the sense, so I was looking at sort of like expert work, like development officers, like the PMs, the ECs, which I didn't know the difference between those at first. I had to have that explained to me. The FS category. I didn't get as much into the immigration officers, because I guess they get to determine sort of visas and who gets those and things like that. But yeah, I didn't get into them, but I did talk to some people who had done that work before. So yeah, I didn't talk to anyone at IRCC, which is perhaps a limitation, because I know that their work is quite different, and they're processing and dealing with clients in a different way than many other people in the Foreign Service. And it gives the lie a little bit. I realized I was rereading my articles yesterday just to make sure I knew what I had said. And I think I said in the very first one that PAFSO represents people who are all in one department, which is a bit unique. And then I realized now, like, that was incorrect, right? That there's the people from IRCC who are in a different unit. So yeah, so that's the migration diplomacy as well. Yeah, thank you. So yeah, that's something I would have to go back and look at a little more closely, is how their work differs and what it means. And the other question, what surprised me? I'll say the one thing that has surprised me is one, the complexity of the system, which shouldn't, I guess, because it's government. But my background research that I'd done before for my dissertation and everything else, I'm originally from the U.S., which is why I never took French. I apologize for that. I don't speak French yet. I got my citizenship about a year ago, so I'm dual citizen now. But yeah, in the U.S., the government system is very different. They don't have the same kind of categories, right? Like, everyone is kind of GS, and then there's subcategories in that. And you're like GS 1 through 15, I think, like government service. And then there's some other divisions and things like that. But it's a little bit easier to be mobile between departments and between ranks and things like that. It's not as complex as or maybe not as rigid, I guess, is the better term, right? As what the Treasury Board categories are. So that kind of surprised me. And the other thing that's jumped out at me that probably is worth looking at, but I got to think about how I would come at it, is the idea of training, because that's one of the flashpoints, I think, that has come out a few times. That the training for foreign service officers is not what it was 20 years ago, right? The Cross Canada tour, which many people who are more senior talked about very fondly in interviews with me, it doesn't exist anymore. Several people told me who were early career, like, in their first 5 to 10 years, said, yeah, my first day I was brought to my desk and they said, well, there you go. And you have to do a certain number of things, I guess, in the first couple of years, but there's not a sort of cohesive cohort-oriented training anymore. Which I think breaks down the sense of a shared mandate, of a shared culture, right? Like you fall back on like, well, we knew people who we went to school with at Carleton, and so everyone's gonna fall back on the network they had before they came in, right? As opposed to sort of building something that's more cohesive. But some of the other categories, I guess, get different kinds of training a little more concretely, in part because of the processes they're involved in. So that kind of surprised me, actually, that the training is not there in the way that I thought it would be. And there's been studies on this where people are doing sort of comparative studies. So yeah, that was kind of surprising to me. And I'm not sure if they're looking at that in the department, or maybe there's budget cuts coming again. I don't know.
So someone is pointing out that, yeah, the training's changing.
Yeah, okay.
Highlighting the Global Officers Orientation Program, but it's not specific to the Foreign Service in terms of training. So I think there is a recognition, and I think that it's one of the things that PAFSO is going to be pushing, especially now after the pandemic, that there needs to be more of a set of baseline training for people going out on posting. Like when I went out on my first posting, we all had to do at Foreign Affairs, we all had to do 2 weeks of consular training before we went on our posting, and they changed that. Somebody else is pointing out too that IRCC has a very structured approach. So yeah, they're more, they're still more organized in terms of a separate FS category of things at IRCC. Whereas for us, that sort of went out of fashion. Like, FS, you're not special. Why do you need special training? And it's like, maybe because we're the ones who are going overseas still, a large hunk of the time. And they're, trainings to be training for development stuff.
And I guess it's tied to certain kinds of, the development people, I guess, have to be aware of certain kinds of requirements under the accountability legislation and the GNC processes. And I would imagine for IRCC, there's probably something about visa processing that they definitely need to know these particular things, where legislation. It seems like the FS work is much more open within GAC, right? Like, but yeah, I was kind of surprised that everyone that went on that cross Canada tour was like, oh yeah, I still keep in touch with the people that I did the training with 25 years ago, and that's built a social network, and it seems like that's kind of gone. Like,
yeah, there isn't that idea of a class kind of coming in to
I saw a couple. Do you mind if I answer the one?
No, please do.
Yeah, so Amy asked, as a researcher, how do you tease out the joke about Birkenstocks versus how much is reality? I don't know, that's hard. Like, sometimes people indicate very quickly that they're just joking, in part because they see me like taking notes. Other times, sometimes it was clearly not a joke. Some people would sort of joke about it, and then they would follow up with it with particular ways indicating like, yeah, what I mean to say is this particular group is not as professional in the way they look, right? And that's a problem. So usually people would let me know whether they were joking or not. Particularly people that are posted abroad that I talked to, and I did get to talk to quite a few. They work much more closely because the embassy space is different from being in one of the towers or in the Diefenbaker building or something. Where you're maybe cut off from people. Like, I got the sense at Post, people are working much more closely together. I saw that actually when I went to a couple different places. And one person told me, the only other, I think he was a Foreign Service officer, and his spouse was former FSO, but then was working now in the Trade Commission or something, so they could be at the same post. And he said, the only person I've ever seen wear Birkenstocks to work was my wife, and she just wears them when she takes her other shoes off, right? Like, other than that, we all know it's a joke. So usually people would sort of follow it up like that and tell me. Sometimes it was a little harder to tell, right? You get from other comments like whether the thing about clothing was a joke or whether it was sort of half serious. So yeah, what wasn't a joke is that people were very happy not to wear a tie when they didn't have to wear one. They were like, woo, I can take the tie off. So yeah, it's hard though, because I had to sort of, people knew I was going to write about them, and I had to be careful how I use quotes and things like that, because people are posted in certain places where there may only be like 12 people, and so you don't want to you don't want to say too much that's too specific and give it away, right? Or maybe somebody's told the same joke about their Birkenstock friend 20 times and people are going to know it when you use it. So, yeah. But it was hard. I mean, I got the sense, though, that somebody said, thanks for a frank discussion. I'll be frank again. I felt sometimes when I was doing my interviews that I was in a faculty meeting, because faculty, we like to, everyone's very expert, right, in what they do. We're all credentialed. Hell hath no fury like a full professor, mine like with a minor inconvenience placed before them. So I got the sense from a lot of people that if you ask them about their work, they're going to tell you everything, right? If you just show some interest in what they're doing, which I am interested in what people are doing and the nature of their work and how it proceeds on a day-to-day basis, then they're willing to tell you a lot of things. The bigger problem I had was like, who can I tell is scratching an itch or has an axe to grind, and who is telling me something that's a little more like broad-based that I can use, as opposed to an idiosyncratic concern. But even that can be a window into something. So, yeah. And then the other question, do I plan to write a follow-up report? Yeah, I've written 3 sort of progress reports at the end of each sort of funding year, May, June, which would be now. I wasn't able to do many interviews in the last year. I only did a couple at the very end of last summer after the last report. And that's in part because of my crazy, my own schedule with a kid and advising and all kinds of other stuff. I would like to write one. I was going to write one this year with some sort of policy recommendations, but now I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to do that. The FSIA thing did come up so much. Pam was telling me a little bit the other day about how that sort of has shaken out. So yeah, I don't know. I'll have to get into it a little bit more, I think. I'm not sure I have enough from the last year to write a follow-up 4th report that is going to be worthwhile to anyone. Because I hesitate from a sort of academic standpoint to make a bunch of policy recommendations, in part because I ended up not looking at policy. I ended up looking at, what does it mean to work in global affairs, as opposed to what should the Canadian government be thinking about as far as fine-tuning or adjusting these or those policies. But yeah, and the mobility has changed. Pam was just telling me about that the other day. I'll have to look into that more before I can think about what to do with that. I mean, I would like to write something, but I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do anything that's going to be worthwhile. So, yeah. Let's see. Oh, there's a lot of more comments. 7.
So I see there was an interesting question about generational differences.
Oh,
did you notice that one that much when you were doing your research?
Yeah, particularly toward the last year when I was able to get more sort of early career folks. Yeah, there were quite a few. I mean, who said, these divisions that are holdovers from the pre-amalgamation matter less to me, right? As a younger person who's in the department, I'm not worried about what the CIDA people used to be like. We all have to work together. So the generational divide I saw in one sense was about that, right? That the the institutional cultures that were being brought together had less meaning for them because they weren't sort of inculcated in them as deeply. And so, and I've read a few reports that were like internal reports and talked to people who were a little bit higher up who said, it's going to take time, right? There's one report, I don't know, some people are surprised that it exists, like they haven't heard of it, because I think it was only meant to be used internally, but I don't think anything ever amounted from it. It was sort of a look at the EX level, the de-streaming of the EX level, and how it was working there. And there was a guesstimate that it would take 5 to 10 years for sort of institutional culture to emerge. And I thought 5 to 10 years is pretty optimistic. The trade move that happened, I think in 1982 or 83, where they brought parts of the trade service in, that still sometimes comes up, that the trade people, we're in our own building and we do something different and we use a different language of clients, and like we're more like the political side than the development side, but we work with development, and there still seems to be quite a bit there, and people who are holdovers from that, I mean, that's a generational thing. So yeah, the generational divide I see is people who are also, because they didn't go through the same training, they've built their social networks in a different way. They as I said, many people who were early career said, yeah, the people I talked to in the department are people I went to school with, right, who came in, or people in my immediate circle. I don't have like a big network across the whole department that I've gotten from a cohort-oriented training session. And I think younger people, and I say younger, I mean, I'm 43. Younger people is anyone younger than me. So people in their late 20s, early 30s who are coming into the department, I think they're more apt to jump between jobs, right? There's a different sense of what it means to have sort of career progression. And I didn't ask about that as much. It didn't come up as much, but several people I talked to who were newer entrants into the Foreign Service or into the department generally had multiple government positions already through temporary contracts. And so their sense of what it means to be in the Foreign Service is a bit different, right? It's something they've aimed for, and it's taken a long time to get there, but they've also jumped between things. So I think that's the sense of what the job is and what the career is might be slightly different. But I didn't talk to enough people and ask about that directly enough to know if that's generalizable. So yeah, but there's definitely a generational difference, I think. Maybe people are a little more adept at the sort of digital diplomacy and things like that as well, but I'm not sure.
Someone just raised to me on another note about the whole issue of dress codes and requiring, certain standards, and how that plays out with gender and different cultures, different groups that are coming into the departments. Did that come up at all in your research? I mean, I think sometimes a dress code or standard can really help to kind of build a sense of cohesiveness. Someone else reminded us of the whole PAFSO purple thing that we did during the strike, where we dressed down to work and we wore purple. But other times, I mean, it can get quite fraught. As anyone who's ever had to take someone aside and say, okay, we don't actually have a dress code here, but what you're wearing is going to cause problems. I mean, it can be quite a difficult thing to do, and there's a lot behind it. I don't know how much that came up for you.
Yeah, not so much in terms of dress code. I mean, people talked about how if they came in on a day when they were dressed a little more casual, they would feel kind of like eyes were on them, like, oh, like, what are you doing here? The gender thing came up a little more often, and in more general terms. I mean, someone has sent me a message about, not everybody can rely on their sort of university cohort. So maybe this goes back to the last question as well. I mean, there is concern because there hasn't been much hiring, I guess. And as the department has tried to diversify its officer corps, you get the sense that they're not, like, recruitment is hard, particularly. I don't know how quite to put this because I haven't looked into it closely enough, but you you run the risk of sort of reproducing the idea that the people who should be diplomats are people who have the right connections, and you end up with a bunch of white guys from the Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto axis, right? So several people did express concern to me, like, well, Canada's a very diverse country. We're supposed to be a leader on gender rights and all these other things, and how can we do that if we're recruiting from a very narrow base of people, right? You have to be bilingual, which not everyone always is at the right level, and so if you're not recruiting and doing language training and like looking at the whole of Canada as your recruitment base, you run the risk of having a very narrow set of people represent Canada abroad. That doesn't really reflect the diversity of Canada itself, of the Canadian people. So a few people did express that to me, right? That maybe there's concern that you're not going to, if you're a student at UBC or University of Alberta or something, and you're like, I really want to go on the Foreign Service, it's going to be harder than if you were at Carleton or McGill or something, because you got to have those credentials and you're building these networks, and the francophone aspect is a little bit difficult. So I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of different dividing lines, and yeah, they came out in multiple different ways because sometimes it depended on the person, their personal experience, their sense of what their career progression might be. There's another question about ageism too, age as well. I didn't get anything particularly about ageism, more about maybe younger people who don't always have the opportunity to buy all the clothes they need. But even that, it didn't come up because people didn't want to talk about it. So yeah, I think dress code would be an interesting way to do it. I'm not sure if people would rebel. I imagine they might, but yeah, there's just a sense that people dress for the job that they want and not the job they have. And maybe a lot of people are comfortable and so they dress however. I don't really know. Yeah, that's a hard question. Just because I didn't ask particularly about this and it sort of came up as a side, I didn't delve into those kinds of things. But yeah, people were concerned about, how do I get viewed in the department based on my work and what it is that I do? Because not everybody sees what everyone else is doing, and so your clothing becomes the way that people are like, aha, yes, you are a development person because your shirt is untucked, or you are a foreign service person because you are wearing a suit that is far too expensive for the job you're doing, or something like that. Yeah, it's there's all these dividing lines. I mean, I guess that's the double-edged nature of a diverse department that reflects a diverse people, right? Like how do you manage that and still keep it sort of in the professional look and way that you want it to operate. So that was a really rambling answer to your question. I'm sorry.
No, thank you. I'm just scrolling through the list of people to see if.
So can you just tell me? So people wore PAFSO. They wore purple during the strike as a sort of sign of solidarity.
There was purple is our color. And so there was a creative dress thing. I see Tim Edwards, who was the president during the strike, is here. And if I can find him, maybe I'll unmute him and ask him to tell you more about that. Sorry, looks like he might have disconnected at some point.
Okay.
We lost.
I didn't. The strike came up very little. I told you that the other day when we were having a discussion. I mean, it came up a few times, and I didn't ask about it, but I thought it would come up a lot more. I was on strike in 2008 for 3 weeks, and I talk about it all the time. It was great. I got to be picket captain. I got to stand in front of a truck. It was awesome. But yeah, it didn't come up very often. A few people talked about it. Mostly it, because people were sort of concerned more with the merger than with the outcome of the strike. It didn't come up. But I didn't realize that there was a sort of clothing aspect to it because I know that you couldn't do a sort of full work stoppage. So
yeah, well, they did selective withdrawals in some places, and our IRCC colleagues were the ones who really made that real for us because they had very concrete impact. But then everybody else was wearing purple on certain days and dressing down, and I remember seeing photos of some quite funny things, and somebody standing in the cafeteria in purple fuzzy bedroom slippers with their suit to make the point. But I think all of that happened when I was on posting in Warsaw, and we participated as much as we could from Warsaw. But we were a minority in our embassy, so it was more kind of for morale kind of stuff. But when I came back, I did notice myself, and I attributed it partly to the arrival of our CIDA colleagues, but I did notice that people were dressing more, not necessarily casually, but to me more sensibly and comfortably, for sort of office policy work where you're not necessarily, in front of a client sort of all the time.
Yeah, I noticed somebody said that, right? Like even at Post, if you're meeting with external partners from other countries, you have to think about how you're representing global affairs, right? I mean, it's but there's maybe a little more. I mean, there's somebody that I quoted in the article that says, when they first started back, I don't remember when it was. They worked there for quite a while. And so, there's 3 suits in the department. There's the safari suit in development and the undertaker suit in diplomacy and the business suit in trade, right? There's only 3 suits. So I just picture somebody wearing a safari suit with a tactical vest with 45 pockets on it or something so they can fill out a grant application or something. I don't know.
Yeah, it's maybe there's some of that.
Yeah, it was hard to know how much was serious and how much was people just sort of perceiving things that they just because of received wisdom is hard to know.
Yeah, yeah. Hey, I realize that there's several people on the phones who've dialed
Oh,
in who won't have the option of chat. So maybe if it's okay with you, I will just unmute them and see if any of them want to say anything, and if they have any questions for you. So just 1 second, I just need to find them on my list. Okay, so I've unmuted you folks who are on the phones. If anyone has any questions for Professor Essex, please ask them. And they're silent. That's okay. So maybe if no one else has any questions, I did have one from. Oh, I see someone asking: as telework and climate virtually become more commonplace, it could be interesting to see how the way we work might influence how we dress. Yeah, true. I've heard a lot of people say that that open offices, have a different effect on women because you feel like eyes are on you all the time and you have to dress more of a certain way. Thankfully, I haven't been in an open office, so this is good. Yeah. Oh yeah.
yeah, the workspace stuff. One of the ideas I had early in the research was that I would like, I don't know why I thought I would be able to do this, but like roam around the building and sort of do a kind of workplace mapping thing. Because I was interested at first in, are they just bringing all the seated people over? And I know some people stayed in Portage or moved to Portage, but are they bringing them over and sort of seating them in all over? Are they going to give them their own tower? Like, what is the workspace configuration going to be like to encourage coherence, which is kind of like a microgeography of the building itself. And I don't know why I thought I'd be able to do that because I've never been allowed to go past like the cafeteria and the library. So, and understandably so, you don't let random people roam around the building, especially if they're there to tell you that you might be doing it wrong. So it is one of those things where many people at first told me that the workspace was insufficient as they were moving. And, that was a transition period for a lot of people because you got new people moving in. The workplace 2.0 thing, are they still doing that where it's like open concept offices and stuff?
Well, theoretically they are, but I'm wondering, I think a lot of it is going to probably be changed by this whole COVID thing because, having people in open spaces, sharing desks and no dividers between people, it's certainly something that we're bringing up at the occupational health and safety level to say, hey, listen, like this may not make sense.
Yeah. Like how are you going to be able to do social distancing would be hard. Because I know they've already reconfigured some things. Yeah, that's somebody told me that they thought it was like, oh, this is like Silicon Valley type stuff. It's like somebody from Silicon Valley did this 5 years ago, and now they think it's like the height of cutting edge stuff. But
Yeah,
I've also heard from people that work in tech, like when you have open concept, you work as slowly as the slowest person. So, it has its drawbacks in addition to maybe promoting coherence and working together. But yeah, what were you going to? Sorry, Pam, I cut you off.
Oh, no. The other thing about open concept is what I noticed is that it's supposed to increase collaboration, but the offices that I visited, a lot of them were so silent because everyone was afraid of disturbing their colleagues. So, you didn't go over to someone's desk or office area to ask a question or to talk about something. You didn't, you don't do it.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's necessarily, and they necessarily does what they think it is. And the government's always like close to a decade behind on any trends, right? So as everybody else is coming out of it, we're just going into it. So someone's that there's a trend to increase casual dress in office environments more generally.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah. I'm perhaps the wrong person to talk about. Faculty are notoriously bad dressers, and that is a stereotype I think that holds true. So yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, it's an interesting thing. Like I think you mentioned the idea of comfort. I think it's also just the cracking maybe of the glass ceiling for women particularly, because there's not, if on the gender aspect, as a man, there's a certain standard of like, you wear a suit and some suits are more expensive and better and others are not, and you know, you can often tell the difference. And you know, there's a clear cut sort of like, this is what's professional, it's a suit.
Yeah.
For women, I think it's a bit different, right? It's more open, right? Like the kinds of things that you might wear that are considered professional, but that are still somehow lacking in comparison to what a man might wear. I mean, if I were to sum it up, I said this, I think, the other day. I mean, one of the things that comes out of this particular branch of the research is it used to be that diplomacy was a man's world, and that meant wearing a fancy suit and looking hyper professional and like you're one of the social elite. And as that's changed over time, as society has changed, now we get the idea that, you know, maybe wearing a suit just reflects like you're the right kind of man, right? Like, and if you're a woman, then you need to be also the right kind of man. I'm not really sure how to put it, but there is a sort of just more open nature to who's allowed to do this kind of work, and that does change like what the standards are that you might use as a yardstick. And yeah, just generally things seem to be a little more casual than before. And I don't know what's driving that particularly, except maybe comfort of the opening of fashion more generally, right? Like sort of democratization of fashion. I don't really know. I mean, I think comfort is a big issue, right? Like comfort in the office. There were some studies. I mean, I didn't use any of these, but studies about how women often find it colder in office environments because men that are in charge make sure the AC is cranked because they're wearing a suit and they get hot more easily. And I don't know like where that comes from, like what journal that was in, but it got picked up in the media and like broadcasts a couple of years ago. I remember seeing it like, aha, we're wasting money on AC because men have to wear suits. And if only they would be a little more casual and less like more aware of the fact that women can't wear suits and wear 14 layers of padding or something.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah,
The aversion to innovation, that did come up a couple times too, the idea of innovation, as Diego has said there.
Yeah, yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I've honestly never thought of foreign affairs, global affairs as being particularly fashionable dressers, but conservative dressers.
Yeah.
You know, more than that. And I mean, I don't know if anybody remembers, but there was that Australian newscaster a few years ago who you know, he did his newscast with a woman who was constantly being criticized for what she wore, and so he, as an experiment, wore the same suit for a year and nobody commented, you know, because it was a standard blue blazer and light colored shirt and, you know, tie, and no one said anything. So there is that idea that, you know, men can meet that marker with a fairly basic look, and unless it's somehow striking in some way, no one is really going to pay much attention.
Yeah, and there's not, I mean, some of the stuff I've read from there's a guy who, he teaches in Britain now and does research in Britain, but he's from Norway, Ivar Neumann. And he worked in the Norwegian Foreign Service for a little while, and has written sort of ethnographies of the Foreign Service in Norway and more generally. And yeah, he made the argument that, you know, from his own experience working there, that people that work in diplomacy and in the Foreign Service or in the foreign ministry, you don't put your name on anything, right? I mean, everything is sort of, you're speaking for the ministry, right? Like whatever process happens in the background to produce a document or a policy paper or white paper or whatever, at the end, there's the name that's on it is the ministry. So, you know, there's not the sense that you need to be flashy and stand out, right? There's a sort of emphasis on, I wouldn't say conformity, but on, you know, consensus. And so, you know, somebody that's going to dress in some flashy way, yeah, I think the goal is to dress conservatively but professionally, in part because there's nothing that says like you need to stand out as an individual kind of who's gonna, you know, cut a wide swath, right? Like we're not we're not looking for Metternich here, right? Like
You want to be flashy.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, that's why I think the image of the pinstripe suit, right? Like there's a standard suit, you know, this goes back to the 50s, 60s, and 70s. You know, that's what you want, right? And if you're not, that's just like the price of entry is like wearing the right suit. And then everything else comes after that. So, yeah. that's it's interesting, like this discussion of what people wear is indicating like so much beyond
It's a
just
stand-in
like
for
how
a
you
lot
put your
of
clothes on.
things, right? It's
Yeah,
it hits at a whole range of things below the surface.
yeah.
So
Uh,
I'm still not seeing anybody using the little hand thing. So I don't know if you guys are shy or you can't find the things, but that means then that yeah, oh, okay. Oh, COVID-19 reality in the Netherlands.
yeah,
So, yeah, thank you for everybody. I mean, it's great to see that we got we did get a big cross section of people from posts, which is really nice, and I'm glad that everybody could, so people could take the time to
yeah.
do something like this. And I mean, I think it was good that this is a non-COVID related topic. I think that this,
We
probably,
can bring it back to that if you want.
yeah, yeah. No, it's well,
I guess it was on This Week Tonight, the John Oliver, satire news show, where he had a supercut of people on the news like doing these Zoom meetings, and it was like 15 of them where they asked the person they're interviewing, like, are you wearing pants? Are you wearing pants there? Are you wearing pants? And it's just sort of like you're professional from like here. I am wearing pants. So, but it's interesting how this has changed the nature of these kinds of meetings, at least temporarily. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen long term, obviously, but yeah, there's a. I mean, I came to my office because I have a 2-year-old at home, and if he woke up at 7 and was like screaming about his teddy bear, so I figured, there's probably no chance I'm gonna be able to do this at home without him interrupting me 17 times. So I'm
yeah.
in my office at the university, but yeah, it's so I had to get up and get dressed and kind of button my shirt up and so.
Yeah, I gotta admit it's easier for me to do these than when I used to go down to the department for 8 o'clock. It was like my eyes always, propped open with toothpicks because it felt ridiculously early. But we like to do them now because if people are available now, if
Yeah,
their calendars are open now, they generally stay open. Whereas if you
yeah,
try to do things over lunch, I mean, you lose people well, for this we'd lose people in other time zones, but also
yeah,
people's schedules tend to change more through the day, so there's more
yeah.
stability at this time.
Yeah, I've done a few interviews at 6 in the morning with people who are like in time zones that were very far from this one, because that's when they have time. And yeah, I wonder I mean, I'm sure within 6 months we're going to have a rash of articles about, COVID diplomacy and things like that. So, how this might be changing, how do you meet with clients? How do you maintain professionalism when you're, in a sort of virtual environment? And there's a lot of questions that might come from it, but I don't want to ask them because I'm sick of coronavirus.
So, well, maybe since I don't see any other questions, maybe I'll ask one that I'm hoping might kind of, selfishly from the point of view of PAFSO, I'm looking for something, some specific tips from you and maybe some comments from the others on this. PAFSO, I mean, the FSIA stream just joined PAFSO in the last year. And we have been making some efforts to try to make sure that everybody feels integrated. Now, I know it's sensitive because, not all of the development community opted to, compete or join the FSIA stream. So they're not all PAFSO members. But I mean, we're looking at doing some things to try to encourage people to get more involved in PAFSO, to feel a part of PAFSO, to feel part of the FS community. And I'm wondering if, out of your research, if you have any advice for us on what we might do. We have a survey that we were just about to launch to the FSIA community before the COVID thing really hit for us in Canada. And so we postponed it just because we felt like it would be kind of tone deaf to be surveying people on that, when there's this big obvious other stuff going on. So that'll come out probably in the next few weeks, and that'll give us some more ideas. But I'm wondering if anything came out of your research that you think we could address.
As PAFSO, you mean particularly for the FSIA or generally?
Well, I think for us, I mean, the ones we represent are the FSIA, right?
Yeah.
But we of course have an interest in the overall cohesion of our work environment and especially our embassies abroad. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, to make them feel part of PAFSO. I mean, I wonder, I don't know how your executive system is structured, but something where you sort of have some kind of either ad hoc committee or a position for those people as a sort of transition period, right, to help them understand what PAFSO does and what it can do for them, because or get them involved so that they can sort of see the broader scope of things with their colleagues, something like that. Or I know we talked a little about the other unions. I mean, not everything always is very smooth between the unions, which is common when you have multiple unions in a single workspace. Yeah, I would maybe reach out to the other unions and see, what is it that your members might want to know about this transition and how the FSIA people are, like, what we expect of them as new members of PAFSO. At Post, it's interesting, I noticed, because every post, it's not like you're in headquarters. Every post is different in the way the workspace is structured, in how people sort of interact, and the balance of, how many trade, consular, diplomacy, development people there are. It would be weird, I think, for people who, I don't know how it would be, but the people I know, the two places I went, if they were like, are they going to move offices within the embassy with a new position? I mean, how is that going to work? I wonder if there's a way to think about, like, at Post, within each post where this is happening, like how people might interact differently or change the workspace so that it's a little more clear, like who's doing what and how they work together. I don't really know, like, what that might look like, because it would be very difficult, because it would be idiosyncratic. I mean, the couple that I went to, one was like a nicer, newer embassy, and one was old. Like, I mean, it was configured strangely because it was from the 70s or even the 60s, I think. And it just sort of been like cobbled to, like, other stuff had been cobbled onto it. So yeah, I wonder if there's something where you can, like, exercise that Post for people who are FSIA and transitioning to a new position that's not really new in some ways, like, so that they understand the change that's happening even as the sort of work is continuing. I mean,
Yeah.
I know that they would, because they've agreed to do this and gone through the whole process, but the other people around them, it might be good to sort of, like, help massage that relationship in some ways, because I get the sense that people who were unsuccessful in the competition, who didn't want to do the competition but might still be working next to those folks, there might be resentment, there might be misunderstanding. There's a greater risk of that, and that could affect people's work and like, I guess, workplace morale even. So something that at those places where you're like, we encourage you to have these kinds of meetings, and here's a set of materials to help you talk about what PAFSO does, about what the nature of this new position is. I mean, some of that's on management and not on you particularly, but
No,
like
but
something where people understand, like, here's what PAFSO is doing, and here's how we intend to work with the other unions if they're gonna be interested in this. Just so you're sort of, because I got the sense from some people that there's a kind of PAFSO is much stronger than the other unions, at least within GAC and representing its members. And I don't think, no one had an indication that, like, oh, PAFSO is like poaching other unions members, right? That's not what's going on, because it wasn't PAFSO's exercise. But like, PAFSO got new members from this, and I wonder if that's gonna, in people's minds, there's gonna be a sort of like, oh, like, of course they get everything. So how can you massage that so that people can still do their work without misunderstanding, and have a good working relationship with each other and with the union? So I don't know what you could do for that, because it's, yeah, I don't know.
it's one of the reasons that we do things like these breakfasts, and we're going to do, I mean, we need to have a look at whether it's still feasible, given COVID and everything, but we were going to do a conference on tradecraft, foreign service tradecraft, and talk about some of the things that, Vic had mentioned earlier about, things that you learn on the job, right?
Yeah.
But what if you happen to be on the job and you have somebody who is not a very good trainer or teacher, or how do you, or somebody else in the next embassy over is really good, how do we encourage people to share that knowledge? But when we do these things, we make them open to everyone in GAC and IRCC, and as well as really, anyone else who wants to join, because we see it as part of our role as a professional association as well as a union, that we contribute to, professional development and things of interest for the community writ large. So it's one of the ways we try to do sort of outreach from the PAFSO point of view to, to not be scary and, all these FS get things and other people don't get things. I mean, there's sometimes a mythology about,
definitely.
what FS do or don't get. It's kind of funny.
Yeah, somebody told me, who was a foreign service officer, oh, it's like Hogwarts. Like, everyone thinks they're in Hogwarts. And I was like, well, I haven't read Harry Potter, but I saw the first half of like 3 of the movies, so I know what you mean. Yeah, I think it's important, I think, to have that kind of outreach and professional, not training, but, kind of like representation, that this is what we do and here's how we do it. And, if you're working alongside us, like, here's what you need to understand about our position and, tell us about yours. And so, yeah.
No, good point. And we definitely should be doing more of that, I think. Maybe I see that we have somebody saying they love the virtual breakfast. So this is great. You're welcome. Thank you for coming, all of you. Maybe I noticed that our population has thinned out quite a lot. I guess as people need to go on to get on with their day. So maybe, unless anybody has any last questions, maybe we will end on this note. I'm just looking at the. I don't see any little blue hands or anyone talking, so, and nothing on the chat. So Jamey, thank you very much for this. It was really interesting.
Yeah, thank you.
I really appreciate you taking the time and being so honest and upfront with us, and sharing.
I know, I'm always worried that I'm a little too honest, and people are gonna be like, "That's not how it is." I'm like, so.
Yeah, no. I was wondering if there might be some pushback from people saying, "Well, wait a minute, this is not how I see it," but I've seen very little. It seems like you've definitely hit the notes that people are it's resonating with people. So that's great.
Yeah. Good.
Well,
yeah, and anybody that wants the article, just send me. I put my email on the chat, like up at the top, but I'm easy to find online as well, and I'm happy to violate Taylor and Francis's copyright and send you the article.
Thanks, and
it's like $43 if you buy it. It's ridiculous. So.
Yeah. And I didn't realize you didn't get any money for it. So
no, I get 0. Yeah. So, but I mean, I get plenty of money from the university, so that's fine.
A well-tailored talk. Thank you, Brian.
Thanks, everybody. It was great.
So for people who are PAFSO members, I will post the articles on the internal website, and we'll also post the recording so that you can, if anybody missed it, they can watch it for a couple of weeks. We won't leave it up forever, but Jamey's very kindly agreed that we could do that, so people can watch it afterwards. So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Jamey, for doing this. And we really appreciate it. And I hope enjoy your parental leave and coming up.
Sabbatical first, then parental leave, and then hopefully coronavirus will be done when I come
Excellent.
back.
Yes, stay away. It's probably not a bad idea for a while. But keep in touch, and we will keep in touch, and hopefully we'll be able to do this soon. For the rest of you, our next breakfast is tentatively planned for the second Tuesday of June, and it will be breakfast with the co-champions for psychological health and wellness, which are me and my colleague Alexandre Levesque from Policy Branch at GAC. So hope to see people there. And thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye, everybody. Have a good day.
Bye, everybody. I'm going to end this meeting now. I have the power. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.